Brabazon and welcome to podcast listeners. Today I thought we'd have a podcast exploring research methods, or should I say a particular research method. There is a reason for this particular interest at this particular time. At Charles Sturt University, our Bathurst campus, we're shortly going to be welcoming two very special visitors to our institution, and those visitors are Jeff Pearson and Jess Richards. We're thrilled that they're coming, but to acknowledge and to welcome them to the campus, I thought Steve and I might do a little bit of prescient homework exploring the research method of ethnography, which is of course their specialism. And I've mentioned Steve, that is of course Steve Redhead. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
And are you ready to discuss ethnography?
I'm always ready to discuss ethnography.
I know, and that's why I've just turned the microphone on and press play and off you go, Steve. But Steve, my first question really, and this is me speaking as an historian, if you will. You have a great heritage and a history in ethnography, but this is me as a curious historian pondering ethnography. Do you think that ethnography is still relevant as a research method, particularly in an age of the read-write web, where we have plenty of information? Why do we need ethnography to create even more information?
Yes, I do think ethnography is as important, if not more important than ever, actually, even in this digital age. I think ethnography has been marginalised in many of the disciplines for all sorts of reasons, which we can talk about, but that it was always, actually in the 20th century and now the 21st, a really important sociological, anthropological method. And I think we forgot about it a lot of the time, and we replaced it with other sorts of methods in social science, and I think particularly coming from a law and criminology background, it seems to me that it is actually as important as ever. And it's great that someone like Jeff Pearson, who's a great ethnographer himself, and Jess Richards, who's doing some really interesting ethnographical work herself, are coming to speak at our institution soon. And I think it generates debate about a method which is really important. But I think it's particularly important now. I see all sorts of other methods as failing to tell us what really the raw realist world is like out there. I think ethnography is more important than ever to actually show how raw realism can work. It needs really good acute theoretical work behind it, but I think it's a critical method.
Well, therefore, let's ponder this, because when I teach oral history, for example, to students, postgraduates, undergraduates, I always say, do not conduct an interview if the data already exists. So if in the archive there is material that can be the evidential base for your work, then don't waste your time, don't waste an interviewee's time gathering information that already exists. So therefore, when do you think, and this might be about topics, this might be about tropes, but when do you think ethnography should be used, and particularly I think when it should not be used?
Well, I think particularly if you look at the criminology background, I started teaching criminology in the mid-1970s, and there were ethnographers all over the place, particularly in criminology and sociology at that time. I became an ethnographer myself.
Well, I was going to say, it's a bit of a 70s method. It's like disco, you know. So,
but we lost that tradition in all sorts of ways. But as, for example, Research Council money, I got Research Council money initially, but as a Research Council money got diverted to the elite institutions, or rediverted to the elite institutions, it was harder and harder for people to get ethnographic money, basically, particularly in the areas of youth culture that I worked in. And you had to be of a certain age to do it. So as that method faded, for all sorts of reasons, but one of them was money, you actually got, for example, writers who I call the repetitive beat generation writers, fiction writers, taking over from the ethnographers.
Yes, so Irving Welsh, for example.
Exactly, Irving Welsh, John King, Nick Blinko, and all sorts of, Sarah Champion, all sorts of others that I wrote about in the late 90s, but actually by that time they were displacing sociological and anthropological ethnographers in the areas that I was talking about. I think it's made a bit of a comeback. Jeff Pearson's a really good example of that. But I think you can almost sort of pick the people on the fingers of one hand in the areas that I'm working in. I mean, I would say people, young ethnographers like Daniel Briggs, for example, whose work on crack cocaine users and also leisure and risk in Ibiza. I think they're really good ethnographers. They're books, and they're really, really good ethnographers that wouldn't have got data. That data just doesn't exist out there. So there's a really good example. Simon Winlow's PhD, which came out as Badfellas in the early 2000s, which is about nighttime economy and bouncers. Another great example. Gary Armstrong's book on football hooliganism, again in the 90s, which is one of the best ethnographies I've ever read, which is about Sheffield United hooligans, called Knowing the Score. And I think you've got Dick Hobbs's work on organised crime, again in the 90s. It's quite interesting that you can date these things.
Yes.
But I think ethnography, particularly in the areas of criminology that I'm working in, and people like Steve Hall and Simon Winlow at Teesside are working in, that ethnography is an absolutely central method. And to some of their work, for example, the Teesside guys, ethnography is absolutely crucial, and some wonderful ethnographies have been done around their work. So I think that my argument would be, particularly in areas like criminology, that the data isn't out there, and you've got to be really, really good ethnographers to get that data.
Now, I'm going to push you on this a little bit. So you've already suggested and intimated in the last couple of minutes that crimogenetic behaviours, so drugs, dancing, urban guys and gals who are graffiti artists, for example, people moving through particularly the urban landscape in alternative ways. Ethnography is a great way to handle it. Deviant leisure, for example.
Yes, exactly.
Is there some linkage there about in a neoliberal economy that is so incredibly normative and compliant, and the pressure on all of us to behave in particular ways, particularly, really controlling the parameters of normal behaviour? So therefore, is it harder to get outside of that neoliberal bubble? So you therefore need to use a really out there research method to get that non-normative behaviour?
Yeah, I think it is. And also the thing about neoliberalism, and particularly in the areas that I'm interested in, neoliberalism has produced a whole series of illegal cultures, for example, around drugs, which are normalised themselves. That's the interesting thing. They've become banal in areas of recession, for example. But to get at that, it is actually really more important than ever to develop particular ethnographic method, but also, I think, to develop theories around that ethnography, in other words, methodology. And my argument has been, as podcast listeners will know from previous podcasts, that originally, when I was working with the idea of bunker anthropology, which came from Paul Virilio originally, but what I developed around that was that, and ethnography comes from anthropology originally, bunker anthropology was designed to suggest that you could come from a position which felt this claustropolitanism I'm talking about, which is a feeling of closed in, foreclosure, wanting to get off the planet, really not knowing how we're going to survive the next day, and so on. Yeah. And that's a cultural condition post 2007-8, in my view, and really important. So methodologies which are after that have to somehow capture that feeling, or what Raymond Williams brilliantly called structure of feeling. So I think it's not just a matter of picking a method, even ethnography, that it has to come from somewhere. And my idea of bunker anthropology is designed to try and push people into that kind of feeling, if you like, structure of feeling, which produces a more accurate ethnography, produces better work. And a lot of the work I've done on, for example, the Football Hooligan Archive, which again we've talked about in other podcasts, was designed not just to be archivist, not just to be an oral historian, for example, when we did the interviews with the people who wrote the books, but actually that should be a method itself, which then allows ethnography. Because how are you going to know about football gangs if you don't find out this from popular culture in the first place? Then you can do the ethnographies. That's what we did at the University of Brighton with the research team that I worked with. So I think basically, it's not just simply a pick and mix of methodologies. I think we have to get this situated context right, and it's ever more important in the neoliberal age.
And I'm going to push you once more, because you've just addressed something that really, really irritates me in the Contemporary Academy, and this is the separation of what tragically is called desk research and field research. This freaks me out. So people are dismissive of supposed desk research, particularly in a digital age where, online, because you're sitting down at a desk, the internet is desk research. And the real proper researchers go out into the field. So has what you've just expressed there, is that a way to stop that binary opposition?
I hope it is. They've got to break down that binary opposition, yes, and I think it's there more than ever. And when people talk about field research, then very often they actually do just talk about more banal methods like survey research and so on. But they are countering that intellectually to, as you say, working with desks, in inverted commas. But actually, it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, it really is. And I just think it's so bonkers, if you're dealing with digital research, that everything that's online is desk research. And of course, digital ethnography is also increasingly important and is a great research method, I think. Yes,
I think so. But I think, it's also the question of the history of methodology and the history of methods. For example, when I'm talking about ethnography and criminology, you have a major history. The Chicago School of Criminology, the Chicago Ecology School, with its particular methods at the particular time they were doing it, right? In the basically the beginning of the 20th century, and it had a tradition, and then it got lost. Particularly with, in criminology, the new deviancy and labelling theories of the 1960s. That actually, although there were a lot of ethnographers came out of that, I think the Chicago School got lost. And I think we have to return to some of that. It's one of the important things about actually learning the history of ethnography and the history of anthropology and sociology. These things are deeply embedded in our culture, academic culture, and we need to be able to reteach it, I think. That history has been lost.
And I would love to teach, and of course, will we ever get an opportunity in contemporary higher education to teach in this way again, but to teach historiographies of method.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And that should be true in all of the disciplines.
Yes, absolutely. And we will go to some of the most innovative scholarship that's occurring at the moment in ethnography. And of course, that is Jeff Pearson's work in so many ways. I back him. I think he's a tremendous scholar.
Super.
And he is producing some of the most innovative ethnography in the world, I believe. So what do you think is so remarkable about Jeff Pearson's work?
Well, I think one of the reasons, this is high quality ethnographic work. That's, we shouldn't beat about the bush. And Jeff's book, Cans, Cops and Carnival, which is his book based on basically 16 years of ethnography of Blackpool fans, England fans and Manchester United fans.
In association football.
Yes, in association football, sorry. And indeed someone like Jess Richards' work around Everton fans, where she's looking at partisan observation ethnography from a female point of view. Emma Poulton's work, for example, which again is really, really important in this sort of area. Again, critiquing ethnography and her own ethnography from a feminist point of view. And I think there's really, really important developments here. Jeff's work's a really good example on its own, but there is also a whole range of other really good work now being developed, I believe, partly through scholars like Jeff. Jeff has developed his own work, but he's developed ethnography fora, symposia, for example, for quite a long time. So there are symposia where ethnographers are coming together. He's privileging that method as part of conferences and of symposia. I think that's really important. He's led that, and you can see how this sort of methodology and method is actually being developed on an international scale now, or redeveloped, I should say. I think we lost it for a while. Now it's coming back, which is great as far as I'm concerned.
Agreed, and that's why I think we're so thrilled to be having him and inviting him to Bathurst with Charles Sturgeon.
Not just to talk about the work, but actually to talk about the method, and I think that's really important.
Final question, Steve, and this has been a really... I didn't think the podcast would go here, but I think it's been a very productive morning. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of ethnography? I'm certainly ambivalent about it, and I think the denial of the digital and the undercooked nature of digital ethnography, which I think is incredibly powerful. Do you remember we had Pharisee's work,
yes.
Pharisee Grouse's work, who went into Second Life and did some fantastic digital ethnography in those online fora. But how are you feeling about the future of ethnography now?
Well, as a Northern Englishman in New South Wales, I'm usually pretty grumpy.
You are.
About these things. And I have to kind of go back to the history of it, really, and remember that at various times in the past, we've come to this kind of pessimistic point before. I can remember when we set up the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture, Derek Wynne and I would sit at ethics committees and put forward our researchers' PhD proposals and so on, which were basically around ethnography.
Yeah.
And the whole point of the MIPC was to set up ways in which we could get young ethnographers into the work. And we used to just howl with laughter afterwards because the people just didn't understand what we were talking about. But also, it was at the height of ecstasy and Gunchester in Manchester. And you could understand why ethics committees ran a mile from our work. But actually, at the time, the point about it was that we were trying to push ethnography, and that got smashed a lot of the time by these committees. So we triumphed in the end, and that work is there for everybody to see. But I think ethnography has been seen sceptically at various points in this history of academia. We have to resuscitate it, and I think people like Jeff's work is a great example of how we can resuscitate it.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think you've really made a very strong case there for ethnography throughout the disciplines, from the high humanities through to the hard sciences.
Yes.
And I think you particularly made the case that in the really complex, difficult communities that perhaps could be reified to the word subculture,
yes.
This provides a way to get in and understand them in context rather than demonising or othering those communities.
Yes, I agree.
So thank you, Steve, and have a lovely morning.